A young multimillionaire walked through the doors of the company she had built from nothing, and no one stood up to greet her. No one recognized her face. No one asked who she was. Instead, they told her to wait in the hallway like a complete stranger. Meanwhile, on the other side of the boardroom, behind thick glass walls, the executives running her empire were laughing and talking about power, certain they were in full control, never imagining that the real owner was already sitting right outside the door. 6 minutes. Grace Whitfield had been sitting outside her own company's boardroom for 6 minutes while 12 men laughed on the other side of the glass. Nobody had recognized her. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a nervous smile, had asked her to wait. "The committee is in a private session," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" Grace didn't answer. Her father's watch on her left wrist was the only clue to who she really was. Nobody in Chicago had seen her in person for weeks. Nobody except 2 people. Through the frosted glass of the boardroom, the shapes moved with the confidence of people who believe no one is watching them. One of them, tall in a deep burgundy tie, was pounding the table between bursts of laughter. Derek Holloway, the chief operating officer her father had hired 15 years earlier, back when Grace was still doing her homework in the back room of the family's textile mill. Derek had been like an older brother to her right up until 3 weeks ago. Grace had spent those 3 weeks in Austin, closing an expansion deal that would triple production for Whitfield textiles across the Southwest. Every Friday she sent a report. Every Friday Derek answered with a reassuring, punctual executive summary. Everything's under control. Enjoy Austin. She had believed him. Until 2 days ago, when Walter Combs, the accountant who had spent 22 years watching over every cent of the company, the same man who had taught her to read a balance sheet when she was 12 years old, called her at 11 at night with his voice cracking. "Grace, you need to come back today before 6 o'clock this evening." "What happened?" "They've called an emergency board meeting, a capital expansion. They're saying they have your authorization." Grace felt the floor of her Austin apartment tilt several degrees. "I never authorized anything." "I know," Walter said. "That's why I'm calling. Whitfield Textiles wasn't just a company, it was the mill her grandmother Eleanor Whitfield had built in 1978 with 4 second-hand looms and a bank loan nobody wanted to give a woman on her own. It was the textile empire her father Robert Whitfield had grown over 30 years until it became one of the largest technical fabric exporters in the Midwest. And it had belonged for the last 4 years, ever since a heart attack took her father in under an hour, to Grace, who held 51% through direct inheritance. Nobody could sell Whitfield textiles without her signature. But a capital expansion was different. If they issued enough new shares and sold them to an outside fund, her 51% could be diluted down into a minority stake. On paper, the company would still technically be hers. In practice, she would lose control forever, and to authorize an emergency expansion without the physical presence of the majority shareholder there was only one mechanism: a power of attorney signed by Grace herself. She had signed one, yes, 2 years earlier so Derek could approve minor operating expenses while she finished a graduate program overseas. A limited, specific power of attorney with an expiration date. That power of attorney had expired 14 months ago. "I need the original document," Grace had told Walter over the phone. "I need to see exactly what they filed with the notary." "I'm working on it," he said. "The notary downtown owes me a favor. Give me a few hours." "You have until 6. Now, sitting in that glass waiting area, Grace watched her own reflection, layered over the laughter of the men who intended to strip away everything her family had built with their bare hands. She didn't feel anger. She felt something colder, something more useful. Silence. Because silence, she had learned from her grandmother, was where the storm gathered itself. A sharp laugh cut through the glass. Derek was saying something that made the others laugh, gesturing with his hands like a man telling a story about a big win. Grace didn't need to hear the words to recognize the tone. It was the same tone he used whenever he got away with something that wasn't his to take. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. A message from Walter. "Got it. The signature on the power of attorney isn't yours. On my way. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The meeting, according to the public schedule posted by the boardroom door, ended in 35. Grace took a slow breath, looked at her father's watch, looked at the glass door where Derek Holloway was still laughing, completely unaware that the owner of everything he was discussing was sitting 4 feet away, waiting for the exact right moment to walk in. Then, among the blurred shapes inside the room, one of them turned toward the hallway and went completely still. The man who had turned wasn't Derek. It was Tyler Brooks, the youngest analyst on the leadership team, barely 23, tie slightly crooked, eyes wide as saucers. He had recognized Grace from an old photograph, the one that still hung in her father's old office. He froze one hand halfway to the glass door. Grace shook her head just barely. Not yet. Tyler understood. He lowered his hand slowly and turned back toward the table, pretending to review papers he wasn't actually reading. Before we go any further, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so the story can keep coming to you. The hallway clock read 5:22, 38 minutes until the session ended. 38 minutes until Walter arrived with the forensic report on the forged signature. Grace pulled out her phone and reread the message. The signature on the power of attorney isn't yours. 4 words that confirmed exactly what she had been afraid of for 2 days. Someone had fabricated a legal document using her name. Not just anyone. Someone with access to her old files, to her real signature, to the company's internal records. Someone on the inside. She thought of Derek, of the 15 years he'd spent running operations of the family dinners, where he called her kiddo boss with real affection, or so she had believed. Then she thought of her grandmother. Eleanor Whitfield was 85 years old, with a memory sharper than any spreadsheet. She lived just outside the city in the same house where she had sewn the very first patterns for Whitfield textiles by hand. Grace sent her a short message. "Grandma, there's trouble at the company. I'm going to need your help." The reply came back in under a minute. "I already knew. Derek's been dodging my calls for weeks. I'm on my way." Grace smiled despite everything. No matter what, her grandmother never waited for instructions. She just acted. Inside the room, the meeting continued. Through the frosted glass, Grace could make out shapes, leaning forward, hands pointing at documents, an occasional laugh that sounded forced, as if someone were trying to keep the mood light, despite the tension underneath. She recognized another voice, deeper, dominating the conversation. Bruce Callahan, the outside consultant Derek had brought on 8 months earlier. Grace had never fully trusted him. He spoke with too much confidence for someone who'd been with the company such a short time. It was Bruce who had drafted the new governance bylaws the board approved the year before. Bylaws that Grace remembered with a chill included a clause for accelerated capital expansion in cases of urgent liquidity need. A clause she had signed without reading closely enough, trusting the summary Derek gave her. That was the loophole, the blind spot nobody had questioned in time. The receptionist, the same young woman from earlier, came over with a glass of water. "Are you doing okay? You've been here a while. I'm waiting for someone." Grace answered calmly. "I'll let you know when the meeting ends." "No need," Grace said. "I'll know." The young woman walked off, a little thrown by the calm of this woman nobody seemed to recognize. At 5:34, Grace's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email forwarded by Walter from his personal account outside the company's internal system. The subject line read, "Urgent handwriting analysis." Grace opened the attachment with steady hands, even as her heart pounded. It was a 2-page report signed by a court-certified forensic examiner Walter had known for years. The conclusion underlined in red was unmistakable. The signature on the filed power of attorney did not match any authentic signature of Grace Whitfield's on record over the last 10 years. It had been forged with the help of handwriting reproduction software that, according to the report itself, only a handful of specialized consulting firms in the region offered. And Bruce Callahan, before joining Whitfield Textiles, had run one of those very firms. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. The missing piece had just clicked into place. This wasn't just Derek acting out of ambition or exhaustion. This was a plan built months in advance, with help from someone who knew exactly how to move along the edges of the law without ever crossing it in an obvious way. She felt a pang of sadness before anger. Derek had been part of her life since she was 14. He'd taught her how to run a production line, how to calculate margins, how to negotiate with suppliers who didn't trust her. Now he was on the other side of a pane of glass, orchestrating her downfall. Her phone buzzed again. It was Tyler this time, through an internal message risking someone spotting his screen. "They're voting in 15 minutes. Bruce says with the power of attorney they filed, they don't need you physically present. Grace, you need to go in." 15 minutes. Walter would still be at least 20 minutes out with the original paperwork, the physical proof a notary would need to invalidate any vote based on a forged document. Grace stood up for the first time in over half an hour. She smoothed the lapels of her navy jacket, the same shade her father used to wear to important meetings. She glanced one last time at the watch on her wrist. Then she walked toward the glass door, ready to interrupt the vote before it was too late, even though she still didn't have the proof in hand that could stop everything. With her hand on the handle, she heard Derek's voice, loud and clear, say the words that stopped her cold. "Let's proceed to the vote. Grace, as we all know, is out of the country and won't be able to participate. Grace is out of the country and won't be able to participate." Derek's sentence hung in the air, so confident that no one in the room bothered to question it. Grace tightened her grip on the handle, but didn't turn it yet. She needed one more second. A second to think, not to react out of anger. Before we keep going, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss how this all plays out. Inside the room, the oldest board member, a white-bearded man named Frank Bishop, raised his hand. "Derek, with all due respect, an expansion of this size should wait until Grace can review it in person. Even with the power of attorney on file, this feels rushed. Time is limited," Frank Derek replied in that same calm voice Grace knew so well. "The Halcyon Fund pulls its offer if we don't vote today. It's now or never." Bruce Callahan cut in, sliding a folder across the table. "The power of attorney has been notarized. There's no legal obstacle here." Grace felt her stomach tighten. A fund called Halcyon. She had never once seen it mentioned in any official report. She pulled out her phone discreetly and typed the name into a search bar while still standing outside the glass door. The first results loaded quickly. Halcyon Capital Partners, an investment fund registered barely 14 months ago, headquartered through a shell registration agent in the Cayman Islands. No public track record. No other known deals. This wasn't a serious buyer. It was a front. Grace understood then the full scope of the plan. This wasn't just about diluting her stake. It was about selling off Whitfield Textile's key assets to a phantom fund, likely controlled by Bruce himself or his associates, at a price far below actual value. Later, over time, that fund would resell the assets, multiplying the profit. Derek and Bruce would pocket the difference, and she would be left holding a company that had been hollowed out from the inside. Her phone buzzed once more, a message from her grandmother. "I'm 10 minutes out. I called Frank Bishop. Trust him. He was always loyal to your father." Grace took a breath. At least there was one more ally inside that room. Someone who didn't know the whole truth yet, but who sensed something was off. Inside, the vote kept moving forward. "All those in favor of approving the capital expansion, raise your hand," Derek said. 6 hands rose slowly. Grace counted from outside her heart pounding in her throat. 6 of 12. They still needed the deciding votes. Frank kept his hand down. Tyler, sitting at the far end of the table, didn't raise his either, though his nervous glance gave away the weight of the decision. "We need 7 votes to pass this," Bruce said, checking his notes. "We're 1 short." Derek scanned the room, calculating who might tip the balance. That was the moment Grace decided she couldn't wait any longer. She opened the glass door. The silence that followed was total, so thick the air itself seemed to stop moving. 12 heads turned at once. Derek went visibly pale, mouth half open, as if he were seeing a ghost. "Good afternoon, Grace," said her voice calm, stepping slowly into the room. "Sorry to interrupt. Looks like you were voting on something important about my company. Without me." No one answered. The soft thud of Bruce's folder slipping off the table was the only sound that broke the silence. Grace Derek stammered, recovering quickly. "We thought you were still in Austin. If we'd known you were coming," "I know," she answered. "That's exactly why nobody told me about this meeting." She circled the table, slowly stopping beside the empty chair that by the bylaws belonged to her by right as majority shareholder. She didn't sit. She preferred to stand. "Bruce Callahan," she said, looking directly at him. "Halcyon Capital Partners, a 14-month-old fund with no prior deals registered through a shell agency in the Cayman Islands. Would you like to explain to the board why my company is about to sell off strategic assets to a company that barely exists outside of paperwork?" Bruce's face tightened, though he kept his composure. "The fund's financial details are confidential, Ms. Whitfield. I'm not authorized to—" "I didn't ask if you were authorized," Grace interrupted. "I asked why." Frank Bishop, the white-bearded board member, leaned forward, studying Bruce with a mix of surprise and suspicion he hadn't shown before. "Derek, did you know about this?" he asked directly. "I trusted Bruce's analysis," Derek answered, evasive. "The whole process followed proper legal channels. The process rests on a power of attorney I never signed," Grace said. Calm and absolute, though every word landed like a stone. A murmur rippled through the room. Several eyes turned toward Derek, waiting for an answer he didn't have ready. "That's impossible," Bruce said too quickly. "The document was notarized, verified." "Verified by whom?" Grace asked, though it wasn't really a question. Nobody answered. Her phone buzzed once more in her pocket. A message from Walter, as short as it was final. "I'm in the building, coming up now, bringing the original." Grace looked up at Derek, who no longer looked like the confident man who had walked in laughing an hour earlier. "Let's continue the vote," she said, with a calm that was more unsettling than any shout. "But first, let's wait for someone I'd like everyone here to meet." The boardroom door opened again, this time hard, and standing in the doorway was an elderly woman with white hair pulled back and a steady gaze, leaning on a polished wooden cane that had once belonged to the company's founder. "Good afternoon," said Eleanor Whitfield, scanning the room with narrowed eyes, like someone taking stock of every face and every lie at the same time. "Looks like I got here just in time for the interesting part." Eleanor Whitfield walked to the center of the room with the confidence of someone who had walked that same floor for 46 years. No one dared speak while she moved around the table, pausing for a moment on each face as if taking roll call. "Derek," she said finally, without raising her voice. "I remember you at 12 years old stealing apples out of my backyard. Never thought you'd grow up to steal something this big. Before we keep going, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe. This story still has plenty ahead." Derek lowered his eyes, unable to hold the gaze of the woman who had watched him grow up. "Eleanor, this isn't what it looks like," he said, his voice weak. "Then explain it to me," she answered, settling slowly into the chair Grace pulled over for her. "You have exactly as long as it takes my granddaughter to finish a glass of water." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Bruce tried to speak up, but Eleanor raised a hand, wrinkled but firm, stopping him before he got a word out. "I didn't ask you anything, young man. When I want your opinion, I'll ask for it, and it won't be soon." Grace, standing by the window, felt an unexpected warmth in the middle of all that tension. Her grandmother still had that gift, the ability to control an entire room without ever raising her voice. The door opened once more. This time it was Walter Combs, his face flushed from rushing a leather folder tucked under his arm. He'd worked for the Whitfield family for 22 years, and in all that time Grace had never seen him this rattled. "Sorry to barge in," he said, slightly out of breath. "I've got information the board needs to see before any vote continues." Derek tried to regain control of the room. "Walter, this is an executive committee meeting. I don't think now is the time." "Now is exactly the time," Grace cut in. "Go ahead, Walter." The accountant opened the folder and pulled out 2 documents, laying them on the table carefully, as if they were fragile pieces of a puzzle. "This is the power of attorney filed this morning with the county recorder," he said, pointing to the first document. "And this is the forensic handwriting report from a certified court examiner, confirming the signature does not belong to Grace Whitfield." Frank leaned over the table to examine the papers closely, adjusting his glasses. "This is serious," he murmured, glancing between the two documents. "Very serious." Walter continued, "I also checked the notary's appointment log. The request to schedule that signing was made by phone 3 weeks ago from an internal extension inside this building, not from Grace's personal number." "Which extension?" Frank asked. Walter hesitated a moment, glancing at Grace, who gave a small, almost invisible nod. "Bruce Callahan's office line." Every eye in the room turned toward Bruce, whose face had completely lost its color. "That's absurd," he said, his voice starting to crack. "Anyone could have used that line." Walter replied evenly, "Anyone with direct access to your office, and with the handwriting replication software your old consulting firm developed 4 years ago." The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't tense anymore. It was the silence of a truth finally settling into place. Eleanor rose slowly, leaning on her cane, and walked until she stood directly in front of Bruce. "Young man," she said, with a calm that was more frightening than any shout, "my husband built this company with his hands, 4 looms and a loan nobody wanted to give a woman on her own. My son grew it over 30 years, and you thought you could walk off with it using a laptop and a fake signature." Bruce said nothing. Frank closed the folder with a firm snap, as if closing off any remaining possibility along with it. "I'm withdrawing my vote," he said firmly, "and I'm calling for this vote to be annulled immediately, pending a formal investigation." The board members who had raised their hands in favor of the expansion began showing clear signs of discomfort, trading nervous glances. "I'm withdrawing my support too," said one of them, a younger man named Kyle. "I didn't know the power of attorney was in dispute." Derek, standing at the head of the table, looked as if he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. "Grace," he said quietly, "can we talk about this privately? There's no need to make a scene in front of everyone." "There's no scene here, Derek," she answered, walking toward him slowly. "Just the truth coming out, in the exact same room where you tried to hide it." She stopped in front of him, close enough that only the two of them could hear clearly, even though the entire room had gone completely silent. "I trusted you for 15 years, Grace said. "I let you hold the reins after my father died because I thought you loved this company the way he did." "And I do love it," Derek said, his eyes wet. "This whole thing got away from me, Grace. Bruce convinced me it was the only way to save the company from a liquidity crisis." "What crisis?" Grace asked, genuinely stunned. "The financial reports I got every week showed solid numbers." Derek looked down, and in that gesture, Grace understood that those reports had been manipulated too. Eleanor, still standing near Bruce, pointed toward the door with her cane. "Young man, I think it's time you called yourself a lawyer, and not to negotiate your severance." Bruce gathered his papers with shaking hands, saying nothing, aware that any defense would sound hollow against the evidence on the table. Grace turned to face the rest of the board, who watched her with a mix of surprise, respect, and in some cases embarrassment for not having questioned any of this sooner. "This vote is annulled," she said, with the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. "And starting right now, I am personally taking over direct supervision of every strategic decision at Whitfield Textiles." Nobody objected. That was when Tyler Brooks, the young analyst who had recognized Grace from the very beginning, timidly raised his hand. "Grace," he said, his voice unsteady but determined, "there's something else you need to know. Something I found 2 days ago going through the international transfer records." Every eye turned toward him. "Go ahead," Tyler Grace said, sensing the afternoon had only just begun to reveal its full scope. The young man swallowed before continuing. "Derek didn't act alone out of ambition, or just because Bruce talked him into it. There are payments, Grace. Regular payments over the last 8 months from an account linked to Halcyon Capital Partners into a personal account registered to Derek Halloway." Derek's face fell apart completely. "That's not true," he whispered, though his voice no longer convinced anyone in the room. Tyler slid his laptop to the center of the table, turning the screen so everyone could see. "Before we go on, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss how it all gets resolved. Here are the transactions," he said, pointing to a column of dates and figures, Every 2 weeks for 8 months, always the same amount, always from the same intermediary account linked to Halcyon. Frank adjusted his glasses and studied the screen, brow furrowed. "This isn't a loan or a legitimate commission," he said quietly.
"This is a structured bribe." Derek sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer hold him up.
"I needed the money," he murmured, more to himself than to the room. "My daughter got sick a year ago."
"The treatments, the private clinics, my salary was never enough." Grace felt something soften inside her, though, not enough to excuse the inexcusable. "Derek," she said, her voice gentler than she expected, "if you had called me, if you had told me the truth, I would have moved heaven and earth to help you as family, not as your boss." "I know," he answered without looking up. "That's exactly why I couldn't tell you. I was ashamed to ask for help from the daughter of a man I owed everything to." Eleanor, still standing near the window, shook her head slowly. Misplaced pride has destroyed more families than any financial crisis ever has. "Derek, you should have known better after all these years by my side." Bruce, who had stayed quiet through the exchange, tried to use the distraction to gather his things and head for the door. "I have nothing else to do here," he said, his voice tense. "Sit down," Grace ordered, without raising her voice, but with an authority that left no room for argument. Bruce stopped in his tracks. "You designed the shell fund?" Grace continued, stepping closer. "You contacted the notary. You provided the software to forge my signature." Derek acted out of desperation. "You acted out of pure calculation." Walter, flipping through another document in his folder, spoke up calmly. "There's more. The public filing for Halcyon Capital Partners lists a sole managing member, a name you might recognize." He slid the paper across the table. Frank picked it up, read it in silence, and his expression changed completely. "Bruce Callahan," he read aloud. "Sole managing member of Halcyon Capital Partners since its formation." A murmur of genuine outrage rolled through the room. "He didn't just design the fraud," Frank said, looking at Bruce with open contempt. "He's the buyer. He was going to walk away with this company's assets at fire sale prices using money stolen from his own shareholders." Bruce didn't bother defending himself anymore. He just looked toward the door, likely calculating how much time he had left before someone called the police. Grace turned back to the rest of the board, who watched her in complete silence. "I want to be clear with all of you," she said, scanning the table. "This company isn't just a balance sheet. It's the legacy of a woman who started with 4 looms when nobody believed in her. It's my father's life's work, built without ever compromising his values." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "And I will not let 2 men hiding behind a pane of frosted glass decide its future without me in the room." Eleanor's eyes, bright with quiet pride, nodded slowly from her chair. Bruce, searching for one last way out, tried a conciliatory tone. "Ms. Whitfield, I understand you're upset, but legally, until there's a final judgment, I remain an outside consultant for this company. I can help resolve this quietly, without a scandal that damages Whitfield Textile's reputation." Grace looked at him without a shred of doubt in her eyes. "There's nothing left for you to resolve here, Mr. Callahan. The only thing you're going to do now is wait for the police." "Are you going to press charges?" Frank asked, surprised by the young woman's resolve. "Of course," Grace answered. "A signature can be forged, a legacy cannot." The words landed on the table with a weight none of them had expected. Frank bowed his head slightly in respect. Tyler, still holding his laptop, looked at her with a mix of admiration and relief. Even Derek, slumped in his chair, seemed to grasp in that moment the full scale of what he had almost destroyed. Eleanor rose slowly, leaning on her cane, and came to stand beside her granddaughter, as if she wanted everyone in the room to finally see the direct line connecting the 2 women. "My husband used to say something similar," the older woman said, her voice steady. "That money can be lost and made back, but a family's word, once broken, never mends the same way again." Bruce stood up this time without resistance, aware that any attempt at defense would sound empty against the evidence piled on the table. "I'm going to need a lawyer," he said, his voice flat. "You're going to need a lot more than that," Walter answered, closing his folder with a final, decisive motion. Grace walked to the window, looking out for a moment at the Chicago skyline, the distant construction cranes, the slow crawl of rush-hour traffic. For a second, she let the tension of the last few hours dissolve in her chest, even though she knew there was still work to do. She turned back to the board with the firm voice of someone who had just reclaimed something she thought was lost. "This session is suspended," she announced. "I'll be calling a new board meeting in 72 hours with an independent notary and an outside auditor present to review every decision made over the last 8 months." No one objected. Not even Derek, who sat motionless, his eyes fixed somewhere on the table. That was when the boardroom door opened again, this time with a sharp bang that startled everyone in the room. A uniformed man with a private security badge on his chest hurried in and went straight to Grace. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, breathing hard. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's something urgent you need to know. Someone just tried to access the company's main server from outside the building, less than 3 minutes ago. An attempt to access the server, Grace repeated, turning to face him immediately. From where? From an outside address, Ms. Whitfield," the guard said. The system blocked it automatically, but whoever tried it knew exactly which folders to look for. Internal audit files, and the transfer records from the last 12 months. Before we go on, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. We're almost at the end. Walter shot to his feet, checking something on his own phone. "Someone's trying to erase the evidence before we get to it," he said, brow furrowed. "I need access to the server room right away." "Go with him," Grace ordered the guard. "Nobody goes in or out of that room without my authorization." The man nodded and hurried off with Walter close behind, his expression shifting from professional calm to a tightly controlled urgency. Bruce, still standing near the table, went pale at the news. His eyes darted toward the door as if calculating an exit. "I have nothing to do with this," he said quickly. "I've been here all afternoon. All of you are witnesses. No one's accused you of this specifically," Grace answered, watching him closely. "But your reaction says more than your words do." Frank, who had stayed quiet, processing the scope of everything that had happened, approached Grace with a serious expression. "If someone's trying to destroy evidence, we need to move fast, before it's too late." Grace nodded, but kept the calm that had defined her all afternoon. She knew giving in to panic now would only help the people still trying to escape responsibility. She turned to Tyler, the young analyst, whose intervention had already proven decisive. "Tyler, can you trace where that access attempt came from?" "I can try," he said, already back at his keyboard. "If they used a dynamic IP, it'll be tricky, but not impossible." He worked in silence for several minutes while the whole room held its breath. Eleanor sat with her hands folded over her cane, watching her granddaughter with a mix of pride and worry she made no effort to hide. "Got it," Tyler said, finally turning the screen around. "The connection traces back to an office in downtown Chicago. A law firm called Ferris & Associates." Bruce let out a barely audible sigh, a gesture so small only Grace, who was watching closely, caught it. "You know that firm, don't you?" she said, stepping closer. "They handle some legal matters for Halcyon," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But I never asked them to do anything like this." "Maybe they acted on their own," Frank said with obvious irony, knowing that if the evidence disappeared, you'd be in the clear. Bruce didn't answer. His silence at this point was confirmation enough. Walter came back into the room minutes later, his face tense but satisfied. "The attempt was blocked," he announced. "And more importantly, we've identified the device the connection came from. It matches a computer registered to Ferris & Associates, the same firm that handled the formation of Halcyon Capital Partners." A murmur of outrage rippled through the room. Even the board members who, less than an hour earlier, had voted in favor of the expansion, now looked at Bruce with open contempt. Derek, who had stayed mostly silent since his confession, finally lifted his head. "Bruce, tell me the truth," he said, exhausted. "How much of this did you plan from the start?" "All of it," Bruce finally admitted, out of strength to keep denying the obvious. "Derek just needed money. I needed a weak company, one without active oversight from its majority shareholder." The two of you fit together perfectly." The words landed on the room like a weight settling into place. Derek closed his eyes, finally understanding that he had been, in addition to a traitor, a piece manipulated inside a much bigger plan than himself. Grace felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The truth, however painful, always felt lighter than the uncertainty had. "Call the police, please," she told the security guard who had returned to the room, "and get our legal counsel on the phone. I want all of this documented starting now, with no room left for any more manipulation." As the guard went to carry out the order, Tyler approached Grace with a shy smile, relieved that his part in all of this had turned out to matter so much. "By the way," he said, trying to lighten the mood, "when you walked through that door, I thought you were about to fire me too, just for sitting at this table." Grace couldn't help a brief smile, her first in hours. "If you'd voted yes on the expansion, maybe I would have considered it," she answered, her tone lighter. "But you kept your hand down. That counts for more than you know." Eleanor, watching the small exchange, let out a soft laugh that broke the built-up tension for a moment. "At least someone at this table still has some common sense," she said, pointing at Tyler with her cane. "Keep him around, Grace. Quiet loyalty is worth more than 1,000 speeches." The moment of calm didn't last long, though. The door opened again, this time more gently, and two police officers walked in alongside the security guard. "Which one of you is Bruce Callahan?" one of the officers asked, scanning the room. Bruce answered immediately. He looked at Grace one last time as if searching for some possibility of a deal that no longer existed. "Right here," Grace finally said, gesturing toward him calmly. "And you should probably also take a statement from the Chief Operating Officer, Derek Halloway." Derek didn't resist. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet Grace's gaze as the officers approached. "I'm sorry," he whispered before they let him out. "Truly sorry." She didn't answer with words. She only nodded a brief gesture that carried both forgiveness and goodbye at once. When the door finally closed behind the officers, Bruce and Derek, the room settled into a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't tension anymore. It was the heavy quiet that follows a storm that has finally passed. Frank walked over to Grace, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Your father would be proud of you today," he said sincerely. Grace shook his hand, feeling for the first time in hours that she could breathe easy. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown, unlisted number, short and enough to wipe out the calm she'd just started to feel. "This isn't over, Ms. Whitfield. Halcyon has more partners than you realize." Grace read the message twice, feeling the relief of the last few minutes cool instantly. "This isn't over, Ms. Whitfield. Halcyon has more partners than you realize." She showed it to Walter, who frowned and asked for her phone to check the number. "Before we continue, hit that like button and subscribe. We're getting close to the end of story." "It's a virtual number impossible to trace directly," Walter said after a moment. "But we don't need to trace the number, we need to review Halcyon's formation records." "Why?" Frank asked, stepping closer. "Because a fund like this, even one that looks controlled by a single person, almost always has silent partners who put up capital without ever appearing on the public record," Walter explained. "Bruce may have been the face of it, but somebody else financed the whole operation from the start." Eleanor, who had been listening from her chair, spoke up with the calm of someone who had seen battles like this before. "In my day, we called that keeping your hands clean and your pockets dirty," she said. "Someone always stays behind, waiting for everyone else to take the blame." Grace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a day that didn't seem ready to end, but she knew giving in to exhaustion now would be a mistake. "Tyler," she said, turning to the young analyst, "can you trace the initial funding for Halcyon? I need to know who put up the first money, before Bruce showed up as the managing member." Tyler nodded, his fingers already moving across the keyboard with a focus that stood in sharp contrast to the nervousness he'd shown just 2 hours earlier. The room fell silent again, this time with a different kind of tension, more contained as everyone waited on the search results. "Here it is," Tyler said, finally turning the screen. "An initial transfer of $2 million made 14 months ago from an account belonging to Andrew Marsh." The name landed on the room like a stone dropped into a still pond. Frank pressed a hand to his forehead, visibly shaken. "Andrew Marsh was your father's best friend," he said, looking at Grace with a mix of disbelief and grief. "He was at your christening. He was in the front row, crying at the funeral." Grace felt something inside her crack, even as her face stayed composed. Andrew Marsh had been throughout her whole childhood a constant presence at family gatherings, a man she had always called uncle, with no actual blood relation at all. Why, she asked, quietly, almost to herself. What did he need any of this for? Eleanor, her gaze drifting for a moment to some distant memory, answered before anyone else could. "Envy doesn't need a good reason, sweetheart. It just needs time to grow quietly. Andrew always lived in your father's shadow. He never managed to build anything of his own as solid as this." Walter, flipping through more documents in his folder, added another detail that closed the circle completely. "Andrew Marsh is also a minority shareholder in Whitfield Textiles. 2% inherited from an old investment he made alongside your father. With the capital expansion approved and with Derek and Bruce controlling the process from the inside, his stake would have shot up enormously once the sold-off assets were restructured. So he didn't just finance the fraud Frank concluded, he would have profited directly from it too." Grace stood quiet for a moment, processing the betrayal of someone she had considered, without fully realizing it, part of her extended family. But instead of letting the pain pull her under, she felt clarity return with more force than ever. "Walter, prepare all the documentation to hand over to the district attorney," she said, her voice firm. "Derek, Bruce, and Andrew Marsh. I want all three of them held accountable legally for what they've done." Even Derek, Frank asked, a little surprised, remembering Derek's emotional confession from just minutes earlier. Even Derek, Grace confirmed. "I understand desperation, but understanding doesn't mean forgiving without consequences. My father taught me that compassion and justice can coexist, but they should never be confused with each other." Eleanor nodded slowly, a look of deep pride on her face that she no longer bothered to hide. "Those are your father's words," she said, her eyes bright. "Even if you're saying them in your own voice." Grace's phone buzzed once more, this time with an incoming call. On the screen appeared a name she never expected to see again after everything that had just happened. Andrew Marsh. The whole room went silent as Grace watched the phone ring. After a moment's hesitation, she decided to answer, putting it on speaker so everyone in the room could hear. Grace, the voice on the other end, said, agitated, almost breathless. "I know what you've found. I need you to hear me out before you do anything rash." "I'm listening, Andrew," she answered with a calm that surprised even Eleanor. "This whole thing spiraled out of control," he said, the words tumbling over each other. "Bruce convinced me it was just an investment, nothing illegal. I didn't know the details of the forgery, I swear it." "Did you know the capital expansion was based on a forged power of attorney?" Grace asked direct. The silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. "I suspected it," Andrew finally admitted. "But I chose not to ask questions because the payoff was too big to risk." "That makes you an accomplice, Andrew, not a victim," Grace said without any unnecessary harshness in her voice, just a quiet firmness. "And that's exactly how you'll explain it to the district attorney." "Grace, please think about your father, about what he and my father never needed to trick anyone to get what he wanted," she cut in. "That's the difference between the two of you." She ended the call without waiting for a response, letting the silence in the room confirm that the conversation was over for good. Eleanor came to her granddaughter and for the first time all afternoon pulled her into a tight hug, not caring that everyone present was watching such an intimate moment. "Your father would be proud, Grace," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And so am I, more than words could ever say." Grace closed her eyes for a moment, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of that extraordinary day. While the rest of the board stood and applauded quietly, without needing words to show the respect they now felt for the woman who had just saved her family's entire legacy. 3 months later, the afternoon sun poured through the same boardroom windows now without the frosted glass that had once hidden everything inside. Grace had it removed the very first week. Before we finish up, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to keep enjoying stories like this one. The company had changed in that time, even though its name stayed the same. Derek was serving a reduced sentence for cooperating with the investigation. His daughter continued receiving treatment thanks to a medical fund Grace, without any public announcement, had quietly set up for employees in crisis. Bruce and Andrew faced charges for corporate fraud and document forgery, with Halcyon's entire holdings frozen. Frank Bishop now sat as vice chair of the board. Tyler Brooks, recently promoted, headed up a brand new internal audit department, created specifically so that nothing like this could ever happen again. Grace stood in front of her father's portrait, hung again in the exact spot it had occupied for 15 years, right next to a new one her grandmother Eleanor painted from a photograph taken back in 1978, holding the mill's very first loom with a defiant smile. "You keep looking at that painting like it's going to answer you," Eleanor said, walking in slowly, leaning on her usual cane. "Sometimes I feel like it does," Grace answered, smiling. They sat together at the table, now empty of the tension that had marked that 6-minute afternoon that changed everything. "How are you feeling?" Eleanor asked, with that gaze of hers that always seemed to see past any rehearsed answer. "Tired, grateful, a little wiser, I think," Grace answered. "I learned that running a company isn't just about signing documents and trusting pretty reports. It's about being present, really present." Eleanor nodded, taking her granddaughter's hand in hers, wrinkled but steady. "Your grandfather used to say a business is built with your hands, but it's protected with your eyes open. Never forget that." A soft knock at the door broke the moment. It was Walter, with a tired but satisfied smile, carrying the final folder from the legal process. "Final judgment," he announced, setting the document on the table. "All 3 of them have been convicted. Whitfield Textiles also recovers a settlement that more than covers any losses suffered during the attempted fraud." Grace took the folder, opened it briefly and closed it again, as if she needed that small gesture to close internally too, that chapter of her life. "Thank you, Walter, for 22 years of loyalty and for these last 3 months especially." "I just did my job," he answered, though the shine in his eyes gave away how much those words meant to him. That same afternoon, Grace visited the small workshop where her grandmother had started it all, now turned into a memorial space inside the new headquarters. 4 old looms, carefully restored, stood on display beside a plaque bearing a line she had chosen herself weeks earlier. "A signature can be forged, a legacy cannot." She stood there a moment, watching the silent looms that had once woven thread by thread the foundation of everything she now protected. Tyler walked up, stopping beside her with his hands in his pockets. "You know," he said, breaking the silence in his usual easygoing tone, "when I saw you walk through that glass door, I thought I was about to witness the most elegant firing in the history of corporate America." Grace let out a real laugh, one she hadn't allowed herself much during those intense few months. "And you weren't entirely wrong," she answered. "Did you ever think about just not coming back that day?" Tyler asked, genuinely curious. "You could have stayed in Austin and let someone else deal with it." Grace shook her head, looking toward the looms, toward her father's distant portrait, visible through the open door. "This company isn't just a financial asset, Tyler. It's the story of 2 people who trusted me without ever saying so, my father and my grandmother. Leaving would have meant betraying that trust." Eleanor, who had walked up without either of them noticing, rested both hands on her cane, watching her granddaughter with an emotion she no longer bothered to hide. "A legacy isn't inherited, Grace," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's defended, day after day, decision after decision." Grace turned to her, feeling those words sum up better than any speech ever could everything she had lived through over the last 3 months. "I know, Grandma, and I plan to keep defending it every single day for as long as it takes." Outside, the sun began to set over Chicago, gilding the windows of the company her family had built with hard work, honesty, and a love that no fraud, no matter how well planned, had ever managed to destroy. Because some things Grace learned that afternoon simply cannot be priced, and they cannot be faked,